Barrett Lewismill's men began to surround Brian, who was lying on the ground. Just before they could make a move, someone wearing a black hood appeared and asked them what they were doing. Upon hearing this person's voice, Barrett's expression changed drastically. He became alert and couldn't help but start sweating. With a confused look, he started looking ahead and wondered what was happening. This person was none other than Cyan Vert, who was standing on a vertical wall thanks to using the power of shadows. While Cyan's feet were emanating a powerful and malevolent energy, he clenched one fist and unsheathed the Karam sword with the other. He began looking towards the ground and soon realized that the bastard attacking Brian was Barrett Lewismill. Brian, who had a bruise on his eye and cheek, started bleeding from his nose. Upon hearing Cyan's voice, with the little strength he had left, he began to look to one side and was somewhat surprised to see that he had come to rescue him. Cyan remained calm, avoiding direct contact with Brian, and upon seeing the absurd state in which he found him, it didn't take long for him to realize that his vocal cords had also been damaged by the beating. Barrett Lewismill turned his body backwards, clenched the fists of both hands, and began to stare fixedly at Cyan. Despite wearing a hood, he didn't take long to recognize him. He couldn't help but smile upon seeing that Cyan had come here on his own accord. He told him that he was going to skin him alive. Upon hearing this, Cyan's expression changed drastically. He started looking towards the ground and couldn't help but smile and feel excited. He responded to him saying that he would be eagerly waiting for that. Cyan decided it was time to stop chatting. He jumped and started running down the vertical wall. He used the 8th assassination technique called Wild Strike. He began moving his sword from side to side, with a serious look on his face as he stared at Barrett, preparing to attack. Seeing that Cyan was ready to strike, Barrett's men unsheathed their swords and prepared to counterattack. But just before they could even make a move, Cyan moved at an incredible speed, and in the blink of an eye, he decapitated one of the men and inflicted a deep cut on the other man's chest. Another man tried to attack by surprise, but Cyan had not let his guard down, so in an instant, he first cut the man's neck and then chopped his head into pieces. In the blink of an eye, Cyan unleashed powerful slashes from side to side, which hit Barrett's men's bodies, causing them to fly through the air. Then, Cyan landed on the ground near Barrett, while he was holding the dagger with one hand and supporting a knee on the floor. Barrett started covering his head and couldn't help but panic and wonder what was happening. Barrett put his arms in front of his face, and upon seeing that Cyan had defeated his mercenaries in an instant, he was left speechless, started sweating, and thought that there really was no way he could defeat someone like Cyan. This moment reminded him of when Cyan had previously created the large sphere of darkness, which had been so big and powerful that even the princess was shocked. Cyan landed on the ground, moved the sword to one side, extended his hand towards him, and while his eyes were shining, he began to look at Barrett and smile. Seeing this, Barrett couldn't help but wonder what kind of monster he was. Barrett wasn't going to let himself be intimidated in this way, so he activated his mana, and his hand started emitting a powerful orange mana. He gained momentum and quickly approached Cyan with a determined look on his face, deciding to kill him. Just before Barrett could finish his sentence, Cyan approached him and gave him a strong kick to the chest. As a result, he opened his mouth and began screaming in agony. Cyan had attacked his lungs, causing him to stop using mana, and slowly the mana that was around his hand started to disappear. After delivering the blow, Cyan landed on the ground, and Barrett's body shot backwards. He started rolling down the alleyway and crashed into the wall. Several seconds later, Barrett sat down, leaned his back against the wall, placed both hands on the ground, started looking at Cyan, clenched his teeth tightly, and couldn't help but wonder why he was so strong. Upon seeing this, Cyan didn't take long to come to the conclusion that this bastard hadn't changed at all. He began to approach him, extending his hand to the side, making the Karam sword disappear. Then, he started looking at the ground and asked him if it was fun for him to torment weaker people. Barrett turned his head to the side, and as Cyan slowly approached him, he simply remained silent. While sweat was dripping from his face, he began to look at him and with a smile asked what his business was in other people's hobbies and also if he was going to kill him for it. Barrett Lewismill was the eldest son of the Lewismill family, who could be considered the real authority figure in the Garam kingdom. In Cyan's past life, he was quite known for his troublesome behaviors. Physically assaulting others was the least terrible thing he had done. He also enjoyed burning small animals alive for his entertainment. But one day, Barrett committed an act that truly crossed the line. He murdered a female classmate. His excuse was that she was practicing magic. Obviously, no one believed this, and in the end there was an order from Mist to purify him, and the person in charge of it was Cyan. When Cyan infiltrated the mansion where Barrett stayed after his expulsion, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but feel disgust and contempt towards Barrett. Upon entering one of the rooms, Cyan saw the countless corpses of the servants that had been kept in the basement. He tortured Barrett, then tied his hands behind his back and sat him on a chair. Despite this, he continued smiling. After torturing him, Cyan was going to kill him in the most painful way he knew, and then he smiled at him, telling him that he should simply kill him instead of prolonging things. That face was still vivid in his mind. He started looking at Cyan and with a psychopathic smile told him that he was fine dying because he had had the fun he wanted to have. Back to the present, Cyan approached Barrett, started staring at him with a murderous look, and after thinking about it, he thought that killing him like that probably hadn't been the punishment he deserved since, as he himself had said, he had already had all his fun before dying. He lowered his head, started looking at Cyan and couldn't help but feel afraid and wonder what he was planning to do with him. Cyan remembered what this bastard had done to Leximus. He began to look at Barrett with a serious gaze and decided that only death was not enough to compensate for the amount of life he had taken away. He put his hand on his mouth, making him open it. Upon seeing this, he became alert and panicked at the same time. He started looking at Cyan's hand and wondered what he was planning to do now. While with one hand he was holding his mouth, he extended the other to the side and invoked a sphere of darkness in the palm of his hand. He kneeled on the ground and sat next to Barrett, slowly bringing the sphere of darkness closer to his mouth. Barrett, who was sitting on the ground, placed both hands on it, started moving backwards, and with a fearful look, began to stare at the sphere of darkness and asked Cyan not to do that. He approached him and asked what he had said he was going to do to him. Upon hearing this, Barrett couldn't help but start sweating and panicking, while Cyan slowly brought the dark sphere closer to his mouth. With a serious look, he began to stare at him and asked if he believed he could avoid the consequences of doing something like that to him. He was a Lewismill, the most powerful family in the kingdom of Garam. Cyan grew tired of Barrett, grabbed him forcefully by the mouth, opened it wide, and without hesitation or second thought shoved the dark sphere into his mouth. While his body was surrounded by dark energy, he began to look Barrett in the eyes and asked him to stop talking so much. With a penetrating gaze, he told him that it was fine for him if he didn't like him. For him, he could move on and even dislike him. Barrett tried to spit out the dark sphere, but Cyan put his hand in front of his mouth and told him that he didn't give a shit about what he said behind his back. Slowly, the dark sphere began to explode inside Barrett's body. Upon seeing this, Cyan started smiling and told him that it would have been better for him not to have put his dirty hands on his subordinate. To him, Barrett was nothing more than a piece of trash, an excuse for a human being. Several seconds later, Cyan released Barrett's mouth. He swallowed the dark sphere completely, turned his head to one side, started sweating, clenched his teeth tightly, put his hands near his mouth, and began writhing in pain. The sphere of darkness began to explode and his body started emitting the same energy as the sphere. He leaned his back against the wall, grabbed his throat with both hands, and started screaming in agony. Cyan simply stood there silently, staring at him intently, enjoying every second. At that moment, someone wearing a black hood appeared on the roof of one of the houses near them. This person began to observe everything Cyan was doing. This person was Ashel's subordinate. He rested his knee on the railing, leaned his elbow on it, started looking down and couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly and feel furious since he had no idea that Cyan was hiding such powers. He decided to notify this immediately to young Master Ashel. While sweat was falling from his face, he brought his hand to his face, began to stare at it intently and thought that otherwise, it could interfere with his plans. While he was lost in his thoughts, Sarika approached him from behind. With one hand she covered his mouth and with the other she started pointing a knife at his neck. Upon realizing that he was the little obsessive stalker who had been following her disciple everywhere recently, she began to stare at him with a sinister look. He turned his head slightly to one side, and upon seeing this, he couldn't help but panic and think that it was all over. At the same time, Brian regained some strength and sat down, leaning his back against some wooden crates. While he was covering the wound on his arm with his hand, Cyan began to approach him. As his body trembled, he turned his head towards him and apologized to him as he had never thought they would attack him in such a large group. Cyan simply started looking at him with a confused look, and the only thing he thought was that Brian looked ugly with those bruises. He approached him, dropped his arms to the sides, started looking at the ground and asked him if he was sure that he was his subordinate, and also asked why he had gotten into a fight where he was going to lose. While Brian was covering the wound on his arm with his hand, he lowered his head and stayed thinking about what to answer. Upon seeing this, Cyan asked if this was the loyalty he had sworn to him. After saying this, he sat on the ground, rested one hand on his knee, and brought his other fist close to his face. Then, he started looking at Brian and with a smile asked why he hadn't simply tried to escape. He more or less understood what Brian wanted to do, so he asked him if he was stupid. He continued looking at Brian and with a serious look explained that he didn't need a loyal subordinate who would end up dead. He asked him not to do stupid things as it annoyed him. After saying this, he stood up and explained to him that they were still going to have a little chat when they returned. Brian, who was holding his arm wound with his hand, started looking at the ground and apologized to him. Cyan turned his back on him, sighed, closed his eyes and asked Master Hall Serica to show herself. Upon hearing this, she asked him if he had noticed their presence. The reality was that there were many members of Mist standing vertically on the walls. He started looking to one side and asked her how could one not notice when she had brought all the members of the hall with her. Several seconds later, Serica, who had captured the man who was watching Cyan, landed on the ground in front of him and explained that she had brought a gift for him. She tied the man's hands behind his back and threw him to the ground near Cyan. Upon seeing this, the man closed his eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, and once again thought that it was over. Cyan simply stood still and asked her if this was the guy who had been following him lately. She leaned against the wall, started looking at him, and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. She asked him if he already knew about this. He relaxed his shoulders, closed his eyes, and replied to her that yes, he already knew about it. Serica crossed her arms, closed her eyes, sighed, and had no choice but to admit that he was talented. He had powers that surpassed those of a Mist assassin. He had intelligence that allowed him to negotiate fairly with the Dean. He had mental strength that allowed him to handle the demonic sword perfectly. For her, he was the ideal candidate to be a successful successor. She opened her eyes, and with a serious look, she explained to him that this kind of thing couldn't continue happening because more people would find him suspicious. He asked her not to worry because he was going to be careful. After saying this, he started staring at Serica with a penetrating gaze and explained that nevertheless, he had no intention of living like an idiot taking shit from others. If anyone laid a hand on his people like that, he would destroy them no matter what. Upon hearing this, she closed her eyes and with a smile, responded to him that she understood. She thought it was good that he protected his own people. She turned her back on him, placed one hand on her waist, started saying goodbye to him with the other hand, closed her eyes and was certain that he would take care of it. So she decided to leave now. Cyan began to look at her with a confused look and thought that this was unexpected. She turned her body to the side, and with a serious gaze, she started pointing at the man and asked him not to forget about him, as she was going to take care of Barrett and his henchmen. Upon hearing this, he turned his body to the side, began looking at the man, and responded to her with an okay. Ashel's subordinate started sweating, turned his head towards Cyan, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked what he was going to do with him and if he was going to kill him. Cyan began to smile and with a murderous look, he told him that killing him would be too easy. Upon hearing this, he felt somewhat relieved. He started looking at Cyan and with a smile, asked him not to think about interrogating him because he wasn't going to say a single word. Just before he could finish speaking, Cyan began pointing at him and asked if he wasn't the #1 subordinate of Ashel. Upon hearing this, he couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised and confused at the same time since he didn't know how Cyan knew this. He couldn't forget that he never strayed from Ashel's side. This guy used to feel jealous of Cyan's relationship with Ashel in his past life. He began to look at the man with a disappointing gaze and thought that he was dangerous, but in another sense. He reached out his hand to the side, and although at first he decided to kill him, later he decided not to do it. He extended his hand towards him and it started emitting a dark energy. Upon seeing this, the man closed his eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, and prepared himself to receive the attack. Although Cyan wanted to kill him, he couldn't do it since this guy was Ashel's subordinate. Slowly, his hand began to emit a dark energy. He started looking at him and with a smile, he thought that he could be quite useful for his plans. He pointed his finger at the man and the dark energy started moving towards him. The man turned his head to the side and upon seeing this, he panicked. He started sweating and asked him to stay away from him. Cyan began to look at the man with a murderous gaze, extended his hand towards him, and with a smile used the creation technique called shadow personality. By doing this, dark energy started to enter the man's body through his mouth and eyes, causing him to twist in pain. Several seconds later, the dark energy began to leave his body through his mouth and eyes, and he started screaming in agony. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.